In preparation for Tish'a B'Av, we're not going to be learning our standard text today. I wanted to share with you a piece that was written in 1941 by Rabbi Yisachar Shlomo Teichtal, Hashem Yikom Damav, may God avenge his blood. He was a rabbi in a little town called Pishtan in Czechoslovakia, and he actually survived the vast majority of World War II. On a transport train, at the very end of the war, he got into an altercation with a Ukrainian soldier who was beating another Jew on the train. And the Ukrainian soldier killed him. And that's how he died. He was one of the most prolific writers of Torah literature during the Shoah. He really stands out together with the Rav of Piazetzna, Rav of Clonimus Kalman Shapiro, as the two great rabbis whose Torah has been preserved from the Shoah. And if we wanted to get a lot of emphasis and a lot of focus has been spent recently on the Rav of Piazetzna, Rav Shapiro, and a little bit less has been spent on Rav Teichtal. Rav Teichtal's Torah is most famous for the work that he wrote called Eim Habanim Smecha. Eim Habanim Smecha is a work that has been translated into English, and I strongly recommend it. Rav Teichtal was a Hasidic Rav in Czechoslovakia. That's where the heart of Hasidus. And he came to the realization later in life, shortly before the war and during the war, that he had to completely reverse his whole position on the Zionist enterprise. He originally was an anti-Zionist, and he did a complete 180 when he came to the realization of what was happening to world Jewry, especially in Europe. And therefore he wrote the text of Eim Habanim Smecha as both a polemic and an apology for why it was necessary for the Jewish people to embrace a homeland in Eretz Yisrael. And that's why it has such important relevance for people who study religious Zionism today. But we can't also overlook all of the other Torah that he wrote that really, and especially because of its historical value, of how he was able to try and find inspiration in one of the most desperate times in our history. And I wanted to go over a piece with you from Rav Teichtal about a Siyum that was made in the town of Pishtan in November of 1941. You'll see from the recording that he leaves for us of his address at this Siyum. Now, for those of you who may have never been to a Siyum, what we do at a Siyum, and actually during the 9 days, Siyums are very popular. My wife just sent me a meme. Now, what do we do at a Siyum? Well, we finish a tractate of Talmud or an order of Mishnah, and then we have a celebration afterwards, right? So many of you have been to a Siyum, and we say a prayer, we recite Kaddish, and then everyone says Mazel Tov, and we sit down to a festive meal to celebrate the completion of another significant portion of Torah study. And during the 9 days, the reason why Siyums are so prevalent is because even though during the 9 days our custom is not to eat any meat, but at a Siyum or at a bris, you can eat meat because it's called the Sudas Mitzvah. It's a mitzvah meal, so you're allowed to eat meat. So my wife just sent me a meme that she received from a friend that says, Jews don't eat meat on the 9 days, but to show you the extent of how much Jews hate eating dairy, some people will actually even learn Torah in order to avoid eating dairy. Anyway, so that's the joke. But the point is that this was a Siyum that was done in November of 1941. You'll see from the words that Rav Teichtal wrote, we're not going to be able to go through the entire text, so I've highlighted certain sections of the text, that this was it was a very dark time in Czechoslovakia, even though the height of the war against Hungary and Czechoslovakian Jews didn't come until towards the end of the war, but it was still quite desperate. People's businesses were confiscated. People had very little money. People were already wearing the Jewish stars on their armbands. And you'll see all of this in what he discusses in celebrating a Siyum in the midst of World War II in Czechoslovakia. And this provides a sort of, if we can try and teleport or transport ourselves to that moment, sitting in the room with Rav Teichtal and a group of Balabatim who were sitting there celebrating with whatever meager refreshments they've been able to put together for this celebration of completing a tractate of Talmud. It's quite remarkable. So it's in the book called Mishnes Sachir, and it's volume 2 of Mishnes Sachir, which was put together by Rav Teichtal's descendants. And this is on page 402. It begins, and we're just going to look at the underlined portions. He says, Hamasechta matchelet ba'ot mem. He says, the first thing I wanted to observe about our Siyum today is that the tractate that we studied is called Moed Katan, which is all about the laws of Chol HaMoed, and it also discusses the laws of mourning in Halacha. And he says, our tractate begins with the letter Mem. Mashkin Beit HaShlachin, u'mesayemet gam kein ba'ot Mem, me'al kol panim. Matchelet b'mem petucha, u'mesayemet b'mem stuma. So our tractate begins with the letter Mem, and it ends with the letter Mem, but it begins with a regular Mem, and it ends with a final Mem, what we call a Mem stuma. Why is it called a Mem stuma, a sealed Mem? Because morphologically, the letter Mem that comes at the end of the word is a full square. Okay? So that's, what is the significance of an open Mem versus a closed Mem? We're going to see. So he says, V'nireh, let's skip to the next underline. V'nireh ba'ezras Hashem yizbarach b'bi'ur hadvarim ka'asher omar lahala. I'll explain shortly what the significance of beginning with an open mem and ending with a closed mem. Aval birosh v'rishona hineni mevarech et habalabatim nichbadim shenatnu kavod laTorah b'hitra'utam et pnei ha'adon Hashem. But the first thing that I would like to do is just to give my congratulations and my respect to all of the Balabatim who have shown up for the Siyum, knowing that it is a very difficult time, but also knowing that we have to find joy even in the most dark of hours. And let's now skip to page 403. He goes through some discussions about the importance of finding joy even amidst darkness. And he says, Harei da haTorah mitchanenet aleinu. See where the arrow is. Harei da haTorah mitchanenet aleinu lahotzienu mimitzukot hatzarot. The Torah beseeches us to be able to pull us out of difficult times. Aval rak im anu notnim libenu lechabed ota, ken yi notenet liba elenu levakesh ba'adenu lifnei haborei kol ha'olamim. The Torah itself, personified, basically says that if you show honor to me, then I will help pull you out of your own quagmire and your own darkness. Ve'ata ki kol echad mikem itzaltem panai uma gam be'es tzora kazu sha'anu ba. He says the fact that you have gone to great efforts to make this a priority in your lives, the Siyum, and especially because it's such a difficult time. Hashem yirachem aleinu b'mehera. May God have mercy upon us quickly. Shekol echad mikem libechem malei tsar v'yagon va'anacha. That each one of you, despite the fact that your hearts are filled with a lot of pain and a lot of dread and worry, ve'ein ha'es kasher lismach b'simchas davar ma, and despite the fact that this is not a time when we would expect any of you to be rejoicing over anything, ki halev ne'echaz be'etzev uvemara ve'areva kol simcha, because our hearts are seized with sadness and with depression and devoid of any joy. Ve'atem kavashtem et atzvotechem shelibechem ubatem laharot leiv sameach el haTorah hakdosha. But you have been able to suppress your sadness, and you've come to show with a joyous heart to honor the Torah. Kain tihu nechonim uvutuchim shegam haTorah hakdosha titein es liba aleichem lahamlitz aleichem lifnei avinu sheba shamayim shiyas esofikates litzarasein. As a reward, may you find a reciprocity from the Torah, that the Torah itself will provide you with a sort of a defense in front of Hashem to deliver you from this very difficult situation. And v'yomar l'tzarasenu dai, may this be the cause of God saying enough for all of our tzaros. V'yikuyim bachem uvanu ve'kel shaka yitain lachem rachamim. May it be fulfilled in you and in us that the God of mercy should ve'kel shaka yitain lachem rachamim. That Yaakov says to his sons when he sends them down to Egypt, he says, may God have mercy upon you. V'chayim lanu ad ha'olam amen ken yehi ratzon. And may he give us life forever. May it so be, may it be his will. Now, he says, I'm going to go back and explain why the tractate of Moed Katan begins with an open mem and ends with a closed mem. Go to the underlined sentence. He starts off by quoting two psukim. One is in Yeshaya and one is in Nehemiah. And he says, in Yeshaya, in the book of Isaiah, chapter 9, it says, Lemarbei hamishra u'leshalom in kates. There will be an increase of rulership and never-ending peace, is what Isaiah prophesies for the future. Al kisei David ve'al mamlachto, for the throne of King David and his monarchy, lahachin u'lesa'ada b'mishpat u'tzdaka me'ata ve'ad olam, to prepare and to be sated with justice and righteousness forever and ever. Kinat Hashem tzavakot ta'asazot, may the zealotry of God, may God's zealousness perpetrate an everlasting rulership for the kingdom of David. That's essentially what Isaiah says. Now, if you look at this pasuk, what's unusual about one of the words in that pasuk? Can anyone see what's unusual about one of the words in that pasuk? Just morphologically, just look at one of the letters that's unusual in that underlined verse. What's unusual in one of the letters? Something should jump out at you. Yes, the first word, what's unusual? The mem sofit is in the middle of the word. It should be a regular mem. Lemarbei hamishra, to the increase of rulership. And the mem is a final mem, and it's in the middle of the word. We almost never find this in all of Tanakh. This is an exceptional situation. Lemarbei hamishra. So the question that the commentaries ask is, why is there a final mem in the middle of a word? And then he quotes another pasuk, which has the exact opposite anomaly, a verse in the book of Nehemiah. And it says, Va'ehi shover b'chamot Yerushalayim asher heim perutzim, that I have been the breaker of the walls of Jerusalem, that they have been broken down. And the word heim ends with a mem that is supposed to be a final mem, but it's a regular mem. The word heim should end with a square mem, and it ends up with an open mem. So that's almost it's the exact opposite anomaly in a totally different verse. V'kan, he says, and so these psukim, how do you reconcile them? So skip to the next paragraph. Va'amru chazal b'midrash, the rabbis tell us in the midrash, al zeh shebala ramez d'chol zman shechamot Yerushalayim heima prutzim k'momem petucha. The rabbis tell us that this is an allusion to the walls of Jerusalem. If the walls of Jerusalem are broken, so like an open mem, in other words, they're not fully sealed all around. That's what you have to imagine when you think of that open letter mem. It's a representation of a breach in the walls of Jerusalem. Surarasan shel Yisrael stumahi unetula mehem. Then that's a sign that the rulership of the Jewish people, our autonomous ability to be independent, has been broken, or really has been sealed. The word sealed over here means that it's been sealed off from us. So that what it means is that when the walls of Jerusalem are breached, we are sealed off from the ability to have independent rulership. Ve'al ken ketuva tevat lemarbei hamishra b'mem stuma lahorot shebe'et sheyistemu chamot Yerushalayim Az yitrabeh hamishra liyisrael l'shalom in kates ad kan devarav. And therefore the Medrash writes, the reason why the mems are reversed is to tell us that when the monarchy of King David will be elevated and the walls of Jerusalem will be sealed all around and we'll have a fortress of the city of Jerusalem, that's when there will be an increase in the monarchy of the Jewish people. The sealed mem in Isaiah is a symbol of what the world will look like for the Jewish people when we achieve success, and that is we will have security on all four sides. That's what the final mem is supposed to represent. That's what the Medrash. So then he says, go to the next section of underline. Ulam tzarich lahavin da hapasuk omer al kisei David ve'al mamlachto lahachinu l'sada b'mishpat u'tzdaka kinat Hashem tzivakot ta'asezot. But he says, but I'm still bothered by the context of that pasuk, because it talks about God's zealotry acting on behalf of the Jewish people. Im tiyeh b'mishpat u'tzdaka, lama yitzarech shekinat Hashem ya'asezot halo tiyeh b'mishpat u'tzdaka. He says that the pasuk seems to be somewhat self-contradictory, because on the one hand it says that it's going to be done with justice. The restoration of David's throne will be done justly. If that's the case, then why does God's zealotry have to play a role? Zealotry implies that God is stepping forward and going beyond what justice demands. So is it going to be done with justice, or is it going to be done with zealotry? So therefore he says, I don't understand. Now, that's going to be his launching pad for the rest of this discussion. Let's go to the next paragraph where the arrow is. V'nakdim ma she'amarti mikvar al kra, dehein am levadad yishkon uvagoyim lo yitchashav, de'amar Bil'am bishvachan shel Yisrael. Let's go back to a pasuk from Parshas Balak, where Bil'am praises the Jewish people by saying, Hein am levadad yishkon. Behold, the Jewish people are a nation that dwells all alone by itself. Dematzinu midah echat be'umah hakadosha ma shelo nimtza b'shum umah v'lashon. This is something unique that we find only among the Jewish people, that is not to be found among any other nation. V'zehu diyesh l'chol umah v'umah dat ve'emunah begiluleihem, aval ein machzikim be'emunatam ve'ein miyakrim et elileihem rak be'et shehem b'ma'amad tova v'yoshvim b'shalom v'shalva. He says, I want to observe something that's unique about the Jewish people. You look at all other world religions. When do people cling to their faith? People cling to their faith at a time when they are ascendant, when they are successful. But as soon as life becomes a shambles, as soon as life becomes difficult, people tend to lose their faith. He says, with the Jewish people, it's just the opposite. Says the Jewish people are unique in that the more we are oppressed, the more we cling to our faith. Aval be'et shehem mesuvachim b'tzarot hema mashlichim kol emunatam miyadam ki dichtiv v'haya ki yirav hatiksaf v'kilel b'malcho ve'elokav. As Isaiah testifies about the other nations of his time. Ma she'en kein b'umah ha'yisraelit af be'et hayoter tzar u'mitzuka hema ovdim et elokei avotam. Turn the page. He says, but the Jewish people, no matter what kind of desperate state they will find themselves in, they always maintain their loyalty to Torah and mitzvahs. Va'ovdim es Hashem b'chol livavam uv'chol nafsham v'holchim b'derech Hashem uv'chol yom v'yom hema mashkimim levate knesios levate mitrashus v'chol v'mitin laTorah. He says, no matter what, no matter how bad life becomes, Jews always wake up every morning, go to shul, go to study Torah. Nothing can pull them away from that daily routine. Umegadlim b'neihem l'Torah ki'ilu ein davar. And not only that, but they raise their children as Torah Jews, as if there's nothing wrong with being a Jew. And despite the fact that when you raise your child in a life of Judaism, you know that you're potentially subjecting your child to a lifetime of persecution. But that doesn't stop us. V'lamrot kol hatzorot v'tokef hagalut shemachbir aleihem einam manichim atzmam lahafriya osa me'avodas Hashem. No matter what, it doesn't bother us. K'mo shanu roim bizmanenu Shehiganu ba'avonotenu harabim latachlit hashiflut u'latachlit hatzarot. And he says, and now I bring it to our days. He says, that's what we've seen in our lifetime. We have reached the absolute low point of our existence. Ma she'efshar lomar miyamein shel Yisrael lo hayta tzara kazot. To the point where I am prepared to say that in the long history of the Jewish people, we have never faced such a desperate time, never in all of Jewish history. So certainly a self-awareness of what's going on is what he's writing about. Ibadnu kol zuchut hachayim shel bnei adam. We have lost any privilege of humanity. They have taken away from us. Va'anu nitunim mamash kehefker l'chol bazui. We have become hefker to anyone who would wish to despoil us. V'sheyachlu la'asot imanu ka'avat nafsham u'chechatzam u'chertzanam. The enemy has done to us whatever they want. U'chamo da'amru chazal b'psikta mahayu yocholim la'asot itanu ilulu she'akadosh baruch hu matzil osanu miyadam v'chol shah v'shah. He says, as the Medrash points out, that were it not for God's divine protection, the other nations of the world could have their way with us and do with us whatever they wish. Richushenu natlu miyadenu, they have taken away our wealth, our assets. Mashlichem osanu midirasenu umeonenu shebaninu me'amal yadenu. They have confiscated our dwelling places that we built with our own hands. They've thrown us out of our homes. Asher barur v'yadua she'ilmale haya na'aseh kazod le'eza uma kvar hayu mashkimim atzmam la'afar. He says, it's clear to me, says Rav Teichtal, if any other nation would have suffered the indignities that we have suffered to date, they would have completely left their cultural attachment to whatever religious faith that they might have. V'hayarucham yotzem mikerbam, and they would lose all hope, they would lose all spirit. And they would not feel any need to endear themselves to their God or to fulfill His will. But we don't act that way. Despite all of the degradations and the indignities, despite all of the inhumanities that they have subjected us to, the dehumanization, Lo olsa biyadam, rak l'shaber et gufeinu v'likach et mamonenu. They've only succeeded in breaking our bodies and taking away our money. Avol beruach shebikirbeinu, lo sholta yadam klal uklalo. But they have not broken our spirit. Ki ruchenu omeid odenu chazak bikirbeinu kimikedem. Our spirits are strong, just as much as ever before. V'lamrot kol ha'hashpalot v'chol habitul she'osim lanu, despite all of the degradations that they have subjected us to, od anu mitga'im al yichusenu ha'yehudi sh'anu zera Avraham Yitzchak v'Yaakov. We take great pride that we are of great lineage, that we are the descendants of Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. Talmidei Moshe Rabbeinu, we're the students of Moshe. Avdei Malkeinu Melech David, and we are servants of our King David. Asher Chai v'Kayam Imanu B'Galut Hamar Hazeh, who is still alive and everlasting in this bitter exile. Let's go on to the next paragraph. So he says that's what Bilam means when he says Hinam levadad yishkon. They are a nation that dwells alone. We are unique in this respect. Uchamo shanu marim zot bebirchatenu. Shanu mivarchim b'chol yom vayom kodem hatfila baruch shelo asani goy. He says we actually daily reaffirm this when we say the bracha every morning of Baruch Hashem Shelo Asani Goy. Blessed is God who did not make me into a non-Jew. Umi b'chol uma v'lashon shahayu shuyim b'shiflut kazu hayam mivarech leilokav sha'asala uma shelo asher nishpala kol kach arza. Who other than the Jewish people could ever make such a bracha in our desperate state? What kind of person would thank God for making me a Jew in the middle of the Holocaust? Who could possibly do that? And yet that is precisely what we in our community are doing on a daily basis. Bivadai shahaya magamat nafsho lichbor bu'umato ve'elokav kidei shelo yakiru bo et umato shenishpala. A normal person would want to conceal the fact that he was part of an ethnicity and of a faith that was being subjected to such degradation and destruction. To save himself just from the degradation. But we don't do that. He says, and he says, what do, the Nazis? They place a Star of David on our shoulder. They make us wear an armband that has us wearing a Magen David, a Star of David, right? They think that they are presenting us with a symbol of degradation. Aval anu nosim et Magen David. Excuse me. We wear the Star of David with great pride. Ki anu ein masichin da'atenu below zeh, ki anu avdei malkeinu David alav hashalom. He says, look at what we can do. We wear this with great pride. I am a Jew, and we wear the Star of David like we're servants of David our king. Va'adarabba bazeh odheim machzikim et tikvatenu sha'Hashem yichonein et kisei Adonenu David od biyamin. And not only that, but they strengthen our faith. Look what they're doing. They're strengthening our faith. That by putting the Star of David on our arms, they're basically affirming that King David is coming back. Uba ha'ot al zeh mehashgacha ha'elyona shenizkar tamid b'kochav David she'ala b'mheira b'yameinu. And what they're essentially doing is that they're sort of reminding us that the Star of David is going to return. The Star of David is coming back. Let's go on to the next paragraph. V'ulai al zeh ramaz hakatuv darach kochav miyakov u'machatz pa'atei mo'av v'karkar kol b'nei sheit. He says, Bilam, let's go back to Bilam's prophecy. He says, a star shoots out from Jacob, and it will destroy all of the enemies of the Jewish people. V'ramaz al kochav David sheyaleh b'yameinu. So maybe that's what the Bilam was alluding to. He was saying that there's the star that they use against us is going to arise. That's what's happening in our day. Ve'al zeh hichrichu osanu lisa kochav David al libenu kidei sheyeh lezikaron neged einenu atidatenu hagidola she'aleha nibu'u kol nevi'av. He says that's what they're doing, is that they're putting us, they're sticking it in front of our faces to force us to focus on the Star of David, so that will be a reminder that the redemption is coming. Kol zot mechazek ruchenu b'kirbeinu shelo yishtocheach nafshenu banu mitokef hatzarot shehigianu. This is only strengthening our faith. It's only strengthening our spirits that we will not give in to the oppression that we've been subjected to. Now let's skip to page 405, to the next paragraph with the arrow to it. V'zeh sheshibeach Bilam et Yisrael hein am levadad yishgan. That's what Bilam was praising the Jewish people by saying, they are a nation that dwells alone. They are unique. Ki heim mityachasim el Elokehem v'torato ki ilu hema yishgenu levadad be'artzam b'li mafriya. He says the Jewish people are unique. We are able to mentally teleport ourselves into a different reality. We are able to, no matter where we find ourselves in Gullus, to be able to imagine ourselves living alone securely as if nothing is wrong. No matter where you put us, no matter what degradation you subject us to, the Jew has the ability to live in another dimension of existence. That we can live alone even when we are not alone. We can live securely even when we are not secure. Uvagoyim haynu mashashorim begalut ben hagoyim bazeh hema enam mitchashvim klal. So that to the point where we can completely ignore the other nations among whom we live. Vizot gedulatam yeter al sha'ar ha'amim. This is our advantage over the other nations. V'havein ki ze emet ubarur b'biur ha'devarim. That's really the truth about what this pasuk means. What this pasuk means is that the Jewish people have this ability, this uncanny ability, to rise above our actual physical existence and be in another dimension, another plane of existence, no matter what is going on around us. That's what he means when he says, Hein am levadad yishkon. We live alone. No matter where we are, we're still alone. We're still by ourselves, securely ensconced within our alternate reality of existence. Do you understand why he has to come to this conclusion based on the cognitive dissonance of being a descendant of Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov and living in this squalor? Next paragraph. Aval de'una rabotai. But he says, I want you, my gentlemen, to know. Im ki emes masha amarti sha'af lamrot kol tokef hatzaros shehigianu lo avadnu et Elokeinu ve'et ruchenu b'kirbenu. He says, no matter what we've gone through, they have not broken our spirit. There's no question. Avol teidu ki lo midat tiviti. But I want you to know that this is completely unnatural. This is not something that is just part of human nature. Ki sof kol sof basar vadam anachnu. Because at the end of the day, we are mere mortals. Umiteva ha'adam be'et shemitkolel b'tzarot nishbaru cho b'kirbo. Because normal humanity demands that when a person is crushed, his spirit is crushed as well. And he forgets all about his duties to his God and even to his fellow man. Where did we get this supernatural strength from? Where did we get this from? Where even in the concentration camps we're looking for flour to bake matzah. Where does this come from? He says we inherited it from our Zaydi, from Yaakov Avinu, because his whole life was filled with that kind of oppressive existence, and he was able throughout his life to rise above it. So he says, Va'alav amar David, Rabat seraruni minu ura yomarna Yisrael. King David said about his Zaydi Yaakov, he says that there were a lot of things, terrible things that happened to me from my youth, says Israel. And this is a reference not just to Israel the nation, but to Yaakov Avinu, Amru b'medrash Yisrael Saba, the ancient Yisrael, our Zayda. V'afal pichein lo sar af kerega me avodat Elokeinu. And despite that, Yaakov never once digressed from the service of God. Kasher Omar alatzmo Rabat Siraruni minu urai Gam lo yachluli. They oppressed me from my youth, but they were never able to break me. La'akev alai milavodet bori. They were never able to stop me from serving my Creator. V'zeh shehitpalel Yaakov Avinu b'seder hashavua v'haya li leilokim. And that's why Yaakov Avinu in Parshas Vayetze, which was what the weekly parsha that they were about to read, at this Siyum. The Siyum was done on a Thursday night. That Shabbos was Parshas Vayetze. And Yaakov makes a pledge to God, and he says, God, I'm leaving Eretz Yisrael. I'm going off on my own into the unknown. I don't know what's going to happen, but I promise that if you will be for me as a God, that I will dedicate my life to you. Upirish Rashi, Sheyachul Shemo Alai Mitchilati ve'ad Sofi. And he pledged that God's name would rest upon him from the beginning until the end of his life. But basically his pledge was, I will not allow anything to pause or to divert me from the service of God even for a moment. And even in the most difficult of times in my life, I pledge to always be a faithful servant. Next paragraph. Uve'emes, kol ma shemisupar miYaakov Avinu b'sedra dehashavua hu remez al hagalut shanu bo. Everything that's mentioned in that parsha about Yaakov's travails throughout his life is really an allusion to the history of the Jewish people. V'chol tfilato haya aleinu, because Yaakov's prayer was not just for himself; it was a prayer for the nation of Israel as well. Shehashem yishmerenu begalus hachel hazeh. That God should preserve all of his descendants, even in the bitterest of exiles. Because remember, Yaakov has a dream as he's leaving Eretz Yisrael about the angels ascending and descending the ladder, right? The famous Jacob's ladder. So who are these angels? A reference to the Medrash says, Al hasulam hayumorim al hadalad galuyot shahayu banav meusadim lihiyot. He says this was a reference. These angels were the angels of the archangels over the nations that would subjugate us and persecute us in future iterations of Jewish history. So one version of the Medrash portrays that there were 4 angels ascending and descending. The first 3 angels ascended the ladder and descended. That represents the fact that these nations would have ascendancy, and then they would decline and fall back down to earth. And that's what happened to Bavel, that's what happened to Persia, it's what happened to Greece, okay? All of these empires that subjugated us. But the 4th angel, which represents Rome, the Holy Roman Christian Empire, he says that ascends the ladder, and the Medrash portrays it as not even coming down. It doesn't come down. He says this represents the 4th exile that we are still currently in after thousands of years. And that, says the Medrash, is what caused Yaakov to be so upset when he saw how long, protracted, and difficult that Golus is going to be. So Yaakov davened for 4 things that Hashem should do for his children. That if God will be with me, this is what Yaakov says in the Torah, and God watches over me on this path that I am going, which means meaning God, if you watch over me during this very, very difficult galus, if you watch over my children, and you give me bread and clothing, then I will return in peace to my father's house, meaning that my children will return to you, Hashem, at the end of the galus, and God will always be for us as a God. Let's continue. Let's skip now to page 406. He quotes an elaborate medrash, which we're not going to get into now, but he says, if you take a look at the underlined paragraph, Be'emes ein HaKadosh Baruch Hu ozei v'zbanav, u'mechin lahem parnasasim b'chol yom v'yom. Based on this pasuk, what Yaakov was asking God is, sustain my children, even in the most bitter of times, in the darkest of exiles, in this 4th exile that we're still in. He says, God always has managed to sustain us and prepare our food for us. Rak ein HaKadosh Baruch Hu megale lahem b'feirush she'yitein lahem parnasasam tamid. The only thing that God hasn't done is demonstrate to us how He's going to provide us with sustenance. Kidei sheyu mispalalim lo yisbarach ala parnasa asher be'emes lo yechsru lahem kol tov. So that we daven to Hashem on a regular basis. So Hashem is waiting for us to pray. So He doesn't want to tell us exactly how our parnasa is going to come, so that we'll pray to Him on a constant basis that He should continue to provide for us. Here, of course, what you're seeing is perhaps he wasn't aware of what was going on in the concentration camps. Auschwitz hadn't yet started in earnest until later. And maybe he wasn't aware of what was going on, about how Jews didn't even have basic provisions and they were starving to death. But at least for him in Pishtan in Czechoslovakia at this time, life was still livable, even though it was unbearable, but it was still, you could still survive. And that's the type of life that he's describing. We don't know where our next morsel of bread is going to come from, but we're not worried because Hashem keeps His promises. Let's go on to the next paragraph. V'davar zeh mamash nitkayem bizmanenu begolus hakasha sha'anu bo. And this is what's happened to us in this very bitter exile. Shalukchu meitanu kol mate lechem. They've taken from us any piece of bread. V'chimat ein lanu bameh lehitparnes, and we have barely anything to sustain ourselves. Afal pichein anu roim shezera Yaakov osim Shabbos kemo ad ata. But that has not stopped us. The Star of David, right? We are still making Shabbos every single week. V'notnim tzedakah umitparnesim, and we're still giving tzedakah from the meager pennies that we have. And we're managing to make a parnasa. V'im yishalu lahem mima ba lahem tzarech parnasatam ein yodim lahashiv ki lo nireh la'ayin klal. And if people ask us, where are you getting your parnasa from? We don't have an answer. We have no idea where our sustenance is coming from. It's just happening. Aval hakol ba mehavtachato yitbarach liYaakov ki lo e'ezavecha ad asher imasiti eit asher dibarti lach. But this is all part of God's promise, that I will not forsake you until I have done to you that which I have promised to do for you, which is not just a promise to Yaakov, but it's a promise to all the Jewish people. Skip the next paragraph, go to the arrow. Ve'al kol panim, ma she'anu holchim b'darchei Hashem af be'et shehagolo takfa aleinu. He says that we still walk in the path of God even in this very terrible exile. Ve'enanu mafrim atzmeinu al yedei tzaros hagolus, and we don't allow ourselves to be bothered by the terrible oppression. Hilav mimidat ha'enoshit. This is not normal human behavior. Rak anu magbihim kochotenu l'mayla mikochot ha'tivi'it umit'amtzim atzmeinu b'chol oz la'asot. We manage to rise above our own humanity. As Yaakov, our Zayda did. We have a regular shir every single week of the Balabatim of Pishtan. Okay? Azarnu Hashem l'sayem masechet b'kibbutz rabim v'hitchanu limod masechta chadasha, to the point where we were able to make a Siyum this evening that we're gathered together, Rabbi Isai. And we've now managed not only to complete an entire tractate, but we're starting a new tractate. V'Hashem Yisbarach ya'azreinu l'lamdo l'sayma mitoch Yeshua klalit liYisrael am kadosh asher neim sofot u'meyachalot liYeshuat Hashem. And he says, and God will help us to make a siyum on the next tractate, which we're going to start tonight. V'gam holchim b'chol yom achar mitzvos hanehugos b'chol yom b'chol bata Yisrael ki'ilu hayinu b'nei chorim, and we still continue to live our lives as observant Jews. We do the mitzvahs every day as if nothing is wrong. V'yoshvim betach al admatenu, and as if we're living in Eretz Yisrael, secure and self-sufficient. V'lo hayinu misuvavim b'shchenim ra'im haravim al chayotenu ve'al mamonenu, as if we're not living amongst evil neighbors who are trying to kill us and take away our assets. K'maimer hapasuk ein am levadan yishkon v'agim lo yitchashav she'enam mitchashvim klalim hagoyim shebesivivoteihem hamishabdim bahem b'shibud kasha mefarechet et kol haguf. We ignore the fact that they are breaking our bodies because our spirits will remain intact, as he had said. Now, let's go to the next paragraph. Ve'al kain osim sudas mitzvah b'simcha rabba. Therefore, we're going to continue on with this joyous, festive meal that we're making tonight for the Siyum. K'moshanu osim ke'et shenit asafnu lachu chag shel simcha b'kibbutz gadol baruch Hashem u'ulam gadol hamaleim anashim b'li ayin hara. He says, look what we've accomplished tonight. We've gathered together in this large hall. Large hall. This is probably bigger than the large hall that he was talking about in the little town of Pishtan. But it was significant. He says, look how many Kanai Nahara. He says, look at all the people that have gathered here tonight. Shabou lateit hod v'yikar l'toratenu hakdosha. All of you have come together tonight to show respect and glory to our holy Torah. V'hasimcha mitnotzetzet mikol panim upanim shezacha likach chelek b'simchat haTorah u'b'simchato shel HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And he says, the joy is shining off your faces. You all have an aura tonight of joy. V'chamo shehiveiti la'el b'shem hayam shel shlomo shesimchat siyum masechet hi simcha b'ma'ono. V'kulanu smechim ki netinat haTorah misinai uchilu ein davar b'chutz misivivotenu. We are now able to sit here in this room as if there is nothing else outside of this room that is bothering us. We are just full of joy tonight, as if we're receiving the Torah at this moment. Hachiyesh tzel safek shesimcha shel mitzvah shanu smechim ka'it be'it hakasheh halazeh shehaya min hateva lanu liot nishkav al haaretz u'larid kenachal dima al gorelenu hamar rachmanu litzlan. He says, is this normal? That we should be able to muster the joy despite the fact that our normal lives would demand for us to be groveling in the earth, pouring down tears, rivers of tears. Va'anu osim ha'hefech mizeh, and we do the exact opposite. Anu yoshvim po bepanim me'irim, ha'me'ir me'hasimcha shel mitzvah va'uchlin dagim tovim v'shotin yayin u'mevarchim l'chayim zelazeh b'lev sameach va'oneg. V'oneg, right? Is we do the exact opposite. We have bright faces that are illuminated by our joy. We're eating good fish, we're having herring, and drinking wine, making l'chaims with each other, despite all of the craziness that is in our lives. V'chol regesh tsar v'yagon ein lahakir al panenu. And you would not, if you were to see us this night and take a photograph of this room tonight, you would never know that we're in the middle of a Holocaust. You would never know it. You would never know that there's anything wrong. V'hakol hu bishvil simchas HaKadosh Baruch Hu v'toraso. And this is all because we take joy in God's Torah. Hachiyesh sad safek shesimchatenu bokim rakim va'ola lamala ad hakisei hakavod. There is no doubt that our joy is breaking through the heavens and is reaching up to the divine throne. Ume'oreret rachamim aleinu lifnei HaKadosh Baruch Hu sheyachus aleinu. And it is arousing God's mercy, and when God sees us in this state, in this very joyous state for His Torah, He is for sure going to have mercy upon us. V'ya'aleinu mibor hagalut u'mibeit hakela hazeh shanu bokeit. And He will pull us out of this pit and this prison that we find ourselves in currently. V'yomar l'tzarotenu dai. And He'll say enough of the tzaros, enough of this. V'yas elanu yeshuos uniflos. And He'll provide us with miraculous salvation. And even if we personally are not worthy of that salvation, God will provide it in the merit of the joy that we are demonstrating on this night. Skip to the underlined lines in the next paragraph. He says, I would like to explain a pasuk that it says, Oz v'chedva b'mekomo. That there's a pasuk in Divrei Hayamim that God says that strength and joy are in His place. So what does that mean? He says, Nir'eh bi'uro behektem Divrei Sefer Shut Yeshua's Malko Lahagon Kadosh Yisrael Rabban Shel Kol Bnei Hagola Maranan Rebbe Hoshualeh Av based in Kutna, the Kutna Rav, he said the following, B'likutei Torah hanisbach l'sham, because of kinimsa gimel shemos nirdafim, simcha sasam chedva. He says, the Rebbe said as follows. He said there are three words that describe joy. One is simcha, one is sasam, and the third one is chedva. He says, what's the definition of these three terms? B'hinei simcha mishma'o she'adam sameach b'davar shelo haya lo me'olam. So, we've talked about in the past the difference between sasam and simcha. This is a new definition. What's the difference between these three terms? He says simcha refers to something, you obtain something that you never had before in your life, and you're happy about it. That's simcha. That's the definition of the word simcha. Sason, mishma'o, adam sameach b'davar shahayalo, v'nevad mimenu v'kibel oto b'chazara. Sason is when you had something that you lost it for a period of time, and you get it back. That's sason. So simcha is you get married for the first time. Sason is you get married for the second time, and you regain the joy that you had previously, or you're reunited with your beloved, whatever it is, okay? So he says, V'zeh sha'anu omrim b'birkas chasanim. Go to the next paragraph where the arrow is. He says, that's why we say in Sheva Brachos, Asher bara sason v'simcha chasan v'kala. In the Sheva Brachos, we use the word sason and simcha. He says, why is that? Ki eitzel hachatan shemachzir avedato umatza otahu sason. He says, because Adam lost a rib. When he finds his wife, oh, my lost rib, that's sason. Okay? So that's sason, regaining something that you had lost. Okay? V'lahakala hu simcha. But the kala didn't lose anything. She's now for the first time experiencing unification with her mate. And that's simcha. So sason is for the male, simcha is for the female. Okay? The chedva, so now what's the third term? What does chedva mean? Chedva hu ma shehadam mitchazek et atzmo b'chol oz lismoach af shenimtza b'matzav shelivkot hu tzarich. He says this is the uniqueness of the word chedva, and this is so powerful. He says the word chedva is when you really need to cry, but you suppress the tears and you express joy instead. That expression of joy is called chedva. That's what the Torah means when it uses the word chedva. It's a different kind of joy. It's the suppression of tears and forcing yourself to rejoice instead. V'zeh she'amar Ezra l'shavei hagolah. That's why Ezra, when he addresses the Jews who came back from the diaspora to build the second temple, he says, Ve'atem al te'atzavu ki chedvat Hashem ma'uzchem. Don't be sad, he says, because the chedva of God is your strength. Why did he specifically use the word chedva? Ki harbei bachu b'zichram et hod bayit harishon. He says so many Jews cried, even though they had just rebuilt the second temple, but they remembered the glory of the first temple, and they knew that they would never get that glory back. Lachein higid lahem lihitchazek v'lismoach b'Yeshua hazu av she'ina begeder harishon. He says, I know you'll never get back the first temple. The first temple is lost forever. He says, but at least rejoice over what you have now. Even though you want to cry, because you're coming back to Yerushalayim and you're not seeing the first temple as you remember it, but you have to have chedva instead. V'zeh shedarshu chazal ma ki chedvat Hashem ma'uzchem lo alai lavu alai va'ani poreya. He says that's why God says, the Medrash says about that pasuk, that the chedva of God is your strength. God says no matter what your financial state is, borrow money to make a beautiful Shabbos and a beautiful Yantiv, and God says, I will pay you back. Ki misha beveito ein kol v'tzarech lilvot al tzarchei Shabbos ein levavovo l'simcha uv'chol zot yesh lehitchazek v'lismach b'Shabbos ad kan devarav. He says if a person is destitute, they don't even have money to make Shabbos with, right? So they want to cry. But no, don't. What the Medrash is basically saying is God says, put aside your sadness, and you have to rejoice instead, because Shabbos is coming. So even if it means you'll have to take from a gemach from Tomchei Shabbos or whatever it is, but Shabbos is the time to express joy, and you have to put aside your tears. So let's turn the page one more time, because we're going to be finished shortly. Top of page 408. Aval be'et sheYisrael shruyim b'tzar gam hu kavyachol b'tzar. This is one thing that we need to remember, is that when the Jewish people are in pain, God is in pain as well. Imo anochi b'tzara. That's what King David says in Tehillim, that God says, I am with you in your pain. Uve'emet hu yitbarach mechakeh liyeshuatenu kamo she'anu mechakim. And God is clearly waiting for our salvation as much, if not more, than we are. Skip to the next paragraph. V'yadua. And he says, as is well known, D'midat HaKadosh Baruch Hu la'asot midah keneged midah. God always repays us measure for measure. Im anu lamata osim hefech haroi b'teva, as gam HaKadosh Baruch Hu imanu hefech haroi. If we reverse the way that we're supposed to feel, then God will act with us in a reverse fashion as well. If we overturn our sadness and turn it into joy, God will overturn our state as well. V'hinei kamo she'anu smechim ka'et b'simcha shel mitzvah b'shah she'hayaroi lanu lihit atzev. And just like as we is rejoicing, even though really this is a time for us to be sad, al goralenu amar b'libkot be'ein hafugot al tokef hagalut ve'al hashibud she'mishabdim otanu shibud ha'mefarechet kol haguf ve'anu mitchazkim otanu b'chol oz liyot sameach b'simcha shel mitzvah. Like we resist the temptation to express sadness and we put on our happy faces. And we fulfill that which the pasuk in Nehemiah tells us to do, is that don't be sad. Now's not the time to be sad. Have chedva. And we fulfill that which our sages tell us what that verse means. Borrow money, and I'll pay you back, says Hashem. Ki adati ki harbe mehane'esafim lo haya l'shalem ma shehaya noten b'chelko al hotzaot hasuda. He says, I know very well that many of the balabatim that are gathered here for the Siyum tonight didn't have 2 nickels to rub together, and some of you didn't have what to contribute to making the Siyum tonight. He says, Ve'afal pichein hitatzmu ba'oz l'smach v'likach chelek b'simcha zu b'nafsho v'mamano. But you managed, no matter how difficult it was, you pulled together, you borrowed, you begged, whatever it took to make this simcha with the herring and the wine, you managed to pull together. He says, "Kamo kein yaseh imanu hakadosh baruch hu lismach otanu ve'oto b'yeshua tovo v'meher lo shi'otanu me'itzaroteinu amar." May God do the same with us, just like we went against every conventional wisdom of what we were capable of, and we managed to pull this tremendous simcha together. God should do the same with us and overturn any conventional wisdom about the fate of the Jewish people and completely overturn what seems to be what we're headed towards. He says, I'm just skipping to the last sentence, he said, V'zehu raboisa yeh totzot hasimcha she'asinu ka'ech b'shah hazot b'ezras Hashem yisbarach. That should be the result of our simcha tonight. Skip to the underlines. V'nira da'al zeh meramzin hamem petucha shel tchilat hamasechet v'hamem stuma shel siyum hamasechet. Now let's go back to our open mem and our sealed mem. Okay, we started the mem. With the mem was open at the beginning of Maseches Moed Katan, and it's a sealed mem at the end of Maseches Moed Katan. L'ramez de'im debe shashi itchalnu hamasechet od hayom hamem petucha shehu moreh al hagolot kanal. The open mem reminds us of the breached walls of Jerusalem. It reminds us of our golos. Aval bizchut halimut shel hamaseches v'gam bizchut haseuda she'asinu be'itzara kazu. But he says, in the merit of our seudas mitzvah, in the merit of our joy, וגם אנו שמחים בשמחה של מצווה וכל פנינו מלא שמחה, אז בשעה זו היה ראוי לנו להתעצב, אף על פי כן אנו מתחזקים מעצמנו על העצבות שהיה לנו מן הטבע ומקיימים הקרא שאמר בלעם הן עם לבדד ישכון והגויים לא יתחשב, שאין אנו מתחשבים עצמנו שאנו בגויים המצערים אותנו. He says, we've overturned our natural tendency to be sad. And that's what is indicated. We started this Maseches with a breached mem. We're finishing the Maseches with a sealed mem that represents our salvation and our security. That's what this Siyum has accomplished tonight. It's accomplished to be able to transform an open mem into a sealed mem. And that's why we started with an open mem, we finish with the sealed mem. Go to the last paragraph on page 409. V'zeh ma she'omar Yeshaya b'kra, deveheveti b'rosh devarenu. That's what Isaiah meant in that pasuk where he talked about justice and at the same time God's zealotry that we brought at the beginning of our essay. L'marbei hamishra l'shalom ein kates al kisei David v'al mamlachto la'achinu l'sa'ada b'mishpat v'tzedek me'ata v'yarolam kinat Hashem tzivakot ta'asezot. He says, what does that pasuk mean? Hakavana da'anu michinim u'misa'adim ota ba'osim davar hefech hatevach moshe katavti la'el. He says, when we rejoice and go against the natural order, then God, by justice, by all rights, will reverse the terrible decree that has been made against us as recompense for our reversing our natural tendency and our natural order. And He will give us salvation forever and ever as a result. Even though we ourselves personally are not worthy, in other words, that's the way that you reconcile it. Zealotry is when it goes above and beyond justice. The justice is that God will overturn the decree because we have overturned our humanity, our human tendencies. But where does the zealotry come in? Personally, I know I'm not worthy of having miracles performed for me. But it's in the merit of our behavior. He says, God will be zealous and overturn the evil decree. And He will, even though the decree of stern justice is what our generation has been allotted, nevertheless, God in His zealotry will overturn that. He says that's the way to reconcile the zealotry. The zealotry is God will overturn His midas adin and go against His normal order. God will reward us for our overturning ourselves and going against the grain of our humanity. Justice demands that He do that, and the kinna, the zealotry, is that God will go against His natural midas hadin, His natural decree of justice, and will save us from this terrible gullus. Okay, so that's, he goes on, but that's the part that I wanted to share with you today. Something to carry with you for Tish'a B'Av. I guess the takeaway from today's discussion is that the key to our survival has always been to arise above our reality and to put ourselves in another frame of existence. So there should come a time, and we've talked about this in previous years, that even during Tish'a B'Av, we have to be able to teleport ourselves to a time of the Third Temple. So that at some point over Tish'a B'Av, even though it's a very sad day because we're commemorating the destruction, and we want to pour out our hearts in tears, there's a point at Tish'a B'Av where we have to actually stand up after the kinos are over and start to think to ourselves about the redemptive future and about how we have to rejoice in Hashem's Torah as well.